All right, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about heritability. So, heritability is the estimation of the amount of variability within the genotypes of a population, which obviously is influenced by the phenotypes' interactions with the environment. So, um, when we talk about heritability, you want to really think about the big picture when you're thinking about how the environment is really influencing the traits or I mean, the phenotypes as well as the connection to the genotype. So putting numbers to the proportion of individuals with a specific trait is going to be our heritability that we're talking about. And some sources of heritability are going to be mutations. They're going to influence heritability in the different alleles, along with the segregation going on in meiosis, the breaking up of the chromosomes. When you talk about diploid organisms, they're going to have two sets of those chromosomes, and you talk about crossing over, where we're kind of swapping pieces of the chromosomes between them. All these are going to be some sources of or influence heritability. So some nuances to think about. Variations in the phenotype are the result of variations in the genotype. But remember that the traits can be hidden in our heterozygotes, okay? Which makes heritability more complicated. Everything's not black and white. Remember, when we talk about our heterozygotes, all right, if you have one heterozygote and another heterozygote, right? What can happen here? Well, yeah, of course, when we look at the traits, we're going to see that we're going to have dominant trait shown here, dominant trait shown here, dominant trait showed here. So all of these look like both of the parents, but what's going to happen is you can also have these individuals that are going to have our recessive trait, and that's going to kind of throw a monkey wrench in the whole idea of traits being passed on and what it really looks like. So some traits are not heritable and are based on the environmental factors. So when we talk about is it heritable, is it environmental, is it an environmental factor, what's the influence, we create this scale. So heritability is measured on this scale, or if you want to think of it as a frequency of 0 to 1. So if a trait has no heritability, we're going to say it has a heritability of 0. Means it's not a result of the genotype, of the genetics, of the alleles, of the chromosomes, anything like that. It's completely based on the environment and the environmental factors. If we say that a trait has a heritability of 1, that means that it is completely controlled by the genotype. If we say something like it has a heritability of 0.5, well, then it's 50-50. Half of it has to do with the genes, half of it has to do with the environment. So if we say an individual's height has a heritability of 0.85, okay, that indicates that if we were to think about genetics versus environment as being 100%, we would say that genes have to do with 85% of it, and there's a 15% environmental factor. So if you think about something like height, right? You're not going to be as tall as Shaquille O'Neal if your parents are both 5'5", or your dad's 5'7", your mom's 5'5". It's just not going to happen. You're not going to, unless there's some hormone imbalance or some endocrine issue or some fluke that's going to influence this. We're really going to see that for the most part, height is really based on genes, but there are some environmental factors that are involved. So it's not completely height, and it's not completely genetics, and that's why your parents want you to eat right and you want you to exercise and have your spinach and everything. That's because there's still a 15% variability. Now, that doesn't mean that, if you are going to be very healthy and eat right and drink your milk and everything like that, that if you do enough of that, you can be as tall as Shaquille O'Neal. No, but it could, instead of ending up being 5'6", maybe you could be 5'7", 5'8". So there is some variability in the environmental factor, but most of it has to do with genes. So we say that we're going to look at it and say that height is a 0.85 heritability. So if you took a cohort of individuals and you created the same environment for all of them, meaning you fed them the same, they had the same health, the same environmental influence, um, but they had genes of different heights, then we could really test our hypothesis that heritability for height is very high. You're going to see that it really, if we keep everything the same, we're going to see that for the most part, it's all going to be based on the genes from the previous generation. So if an individual tells you, just as an example, that male fish are experiencing low sperm counts because of endocrine disruptors, and this is a newer topic that you hear about more and more as time goes on. People talking about endocrine disruptors, things that pollutants, chemicals that are in the water or really in our environment because as time goes on, we pollute things. Things are getting into our water sources, and some of the chemicals that are out there, they actually influence our endocrine system, and they kind of throw off our target cells and our receptors, and they kind of confuse them, and they look like a certain hormone to those target cells, and it kind of throws everything off. So we talk about these endocrine disruptors, and they've seen, this is a real thing, they've seen endocrine disruptors make um, frogs, amphibians, fish not form their reproductive parts properly. But let's say for this example, they find that there's an endocrine disruptor in the water. There's this polluted water where there are these fish, and they're finding that the male fish are experiencing very low sperm count. So it doesn't necessarily, they've seen times where male fish are forming female parts, things like that. But in our scenario, we're just saying, hey, let's say that this endocrine disruptor, this pollutant is lowering their sperm count in the water, but you aren't completely convinced. Okay, they tell you, hey, look, there's this endocrine disruptor. I know that these waters are polluted, and it must be that this is what's lowering their sperm count. But you say to yourself, you know what? I don't know if it necessarily is. I don't want to just listen to you and just assume. So we're going to have to think about this more objectively. Well, is it 100%? Could it be something else? So let's say you say, you know what? Maybe it's genetics. Maybe there's some mutation that's going on in that uh, population, and we really have to test our hypothesis. Is it the endocrine disruptor? Is it something else? Is it genes? Is it the environmental factors? So to test this hypothesis, you'd have to set up a number of experimental groups, and we could have our control group, which could be created by taking a fish with high sperm counts, right? Because we're saying, hey, these low sperm count ones are not the norm. So let's say we'll take the norm, the high sperm count ones, and we're going to mate them in water without the pollutants, in fresh water, and that'll be our control group. We'll use that to compare everything else to, and then we're going to want to see the different outcomes of each piece, each variable to our experiment. So we'll take more high sperm count males and mate them in polluted water now. So you have uh, polluted water, and then we can also then take low sperm count ones and put them in our freshwater ones. And then, of course, we're going to have our low sperm count one in our polluted water, which is what's happening in I guess you could say nature, in real life. That's what's happening. So we have our 4 different groups, and we can compare them. And your null hypothesis is that, hey, sperm count is not heritable. You're saying it is not a heritable trait, but your alternative hypothesis is that sperm count is heritable. So the results show that the male offspring that are raised in the polluted water have a low sperm count. Okay, regardless of the father's sperm count, regardless of the genetics, the male offspring that are raised in the fresh water have high sperm counts, and the ones that are raised in the polluted water have low sperm counts, regardless of what fathers we started with, regardless of um, if the father had high sperm count or low sperm count. We really saw that no matter what, if those offspring were raised in the polluted waters, they had low sperm count, and if they were raised in the fresh water, they had a high sperm count. So now, keep in mind, sperm count is not black and white. It's not just high versus low, but it could be varying numbers. But let's say in this scenario, we're looking at relatively low, relatively high. So now in this example, your null hypothesis is accepted and it's concluded that the heredity of this trait is 0, okay? It's all has to do with the environment. But let's say that a colleague tells you that there is a slight variation in the sperm count. So now they're saying, you know what, there is no just high and low. There's this range of high and this range of low. And what they've noticed is that, and this is just an example, let's say that they've noticed that you're monitoring the specific sperm count of each individual, and you find that individuals in the polluted water can have a sperm count from 0 to about 5 million, okay? And the freshwater ones have a sperm count of 95 million to about 100 million. So that's our range for low versus high. So you have your low lows, which is about 0, and then you have your high lows, which would be 5 million, and then you have your low highs, which is 95 million, and then your high highs, which is 100 million. So now we're looking at, well, there is some variation within that. Although we have pinpointed that, you know what, the environment is really what's influencing this, making it high versus low. But what's this part where we see there's a little bit of range for each one? So the polluted water fish that had fathers with a sperm count of 0 always have 0. And the fish with fathers that have a sperm count of 5 million always have 5 million. So they notice that, hey, you know what? Now it seems like there might be some genetic component. Although it's really what's dictating if you're high or low is going to be the environment. What's dictating if you're low, low, or high, low is going to be something else. So then the freshwater fish will say that the fathers with a sperm count of 95 million always have 95, and the fish that are the fathers, the sperm count of the offspring from the fathers that have 100 million are always going to be 100 million. So you decide to breed fish in the opposite environment. So you see that the polluted water fish with 0 sperm count actually have 95 million when they're bred in freshwater, and fish with 5 million actually have 100 million in freshwater. You also see that freshwater fish with 95 million have 0 in polluted water, and the fish with 100 million have 5 million in polluted water. So now you're seeing, you know what? The ones that have 0, all right, if I change their environment, they're going to end up with 95. The ones that have 5, if I change their environment, they end up with 100. Same thing goes over here, 95. All right, if I put them in polluted water, they're going to go down to a 0. But if I have 100 million, the ones with 100 million as sperm count, and I put them in that polluted water, they still are going to have 5 million. So they end up in that higher range. So from this, it's concluded that heritability is 0.05 or 5%. Okay, so now instead we're saying, hey, 95% of this is the environment, and 5% of this is genetics. So now we're changing what we're talking about. Because of this, we could track minor changes over time and see if a population evolves to have an increase or a decrease in sperm count. So that's how we're going to figure out if things evolve. If there is a heritability, and only if, okay, if it has to do with the environment solely, and we see drastic changes in the population, well, then we're going to say, hey, you know what? It's because these things are growing up in these very different environments. But if we see that, and it can be influenced by the environment, but if we see that something is going to be based on the genetics, it's a heritable trait, and we see the amount of that trait changing over time, then we could say that that population is evolving. That's that micro evolution that we're talking about. So if a population with a typical sperm count of say 100 million, all right, that those ones we had those ones that we said they had 100 million in fresh water, and over time the ones that always had 100 million, let's say we were able to tag the ones that had 100 million, and we could follow those 100 million ones, and over time we saw that those 100 million ones eventually had a sperm count of 125 million, which we didn't really see before. And if this is what's going on when it is heritable, only when it's heritable. If it's we're just talking about a trait that's not heritable, but remember in our scenario we're now saying, hey, well, it's 5% heritable. And if we are able to look at that and we say, hey, now they're becoming 125 million, Now you could say, hey, you know what, maybe it's fresher water, which isn't going to be the case. We're really looking at the genetics. Then we could say that microevolution has occurred. So you want to keep these things in mind, how we're looking at heritability as kind of a percentage, and then we're looking at it on a scale from 0 to 1. But it all kind of has to do. We were looking at the alleles, the frequency. You're looking at the environmental influence as well as its heritability within that environment. So, but remember, the genotype is not necessarily interacting with the environment. It's really the phenotype, the trait that is interacting with the environment. So some final notes, just some things to keep in mind. Individuals do not have heritability. The traits are going to have heritability, the traits of the population. And genes do not have heritability, but rather it's the traits, all right? Because they are what's going to influence survival and what we all really want to do, what it's all about.